All right, folks, my name's Justin Clement. Welcome to another Lunch and Learn talk hosted by the Valley Forge Park Alliance. I think today's talk is very important for the education of our viewership, as well as future interpretation at the park. Now, our two speakers today that I'd like to welcome. First is Michael C. Harris. He's a graduate of the University of Mary Washington and the American Military University. He has worked for the National Park Service in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Fort Mott State Park, New Jersey, and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission at Brandywine Battlefield. Michael has authored 2 military histories on the Philadelphia campaign, focusing on the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. He currently teaches in the Philadelphia region. Our second speaker is Gary Ecelbarger. Hopefully I pronounced that right. He has written or co-written multiple books and articles, including studies on the U.S. Civil War and notable personalities in American history. He claims 10 direct line ancestors who served as patriot soldiers in the American Revolution. Ecelbarger has obtained his MS at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is currently writing a single-year campaign biography on General George Washington. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. All right, so thank you very much, and I'd like to hand things over to Gary.
All right, thank you, Justin. Let me get my screen share up here. Oops. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Hopefully you can hear me. This is the title of our article as it appeared in the Journal of the American Revolution back in May. And I hoped it generated some interest, and I really thank Justin and the Alliance for giving us the opportunity to speak about what we discovered when we were trying to reevaluate the Valley Forge troop strength. So our goal here today, oops, let me do something different here. Hold on, go to this one. I think I had an older one up. Okay. All right, so today I am going to answer the questions of, or try to approach the questions of how and why when I do the introduction and the methodology. And then Michael will pause if there's questions about the methodology. And then Mike will come in answering the what's and the whens with the results, and he'll offer some conclusions, and then hopefully both of us can help answer your questions or generate some new ones based on what we're showing here. So here's a number I think many of you are familiar with, 11,000. Right? Where did that number come from? All right? That's the number that I'm sure most of you know is usually the traditional way we equate the march in strength to Valley Forge on December 19th, 1777. And you're going to be surprised when I show you how far we trace that number back, where it derived from. There were 2 possible sources when Mike and I were looking at this. One turned out to be just coincidental, and that is from a weekly report that added up present officers and men and came up to 11,000 and a little bit of change. That turned out to be a bit of a red herring, just simply coincidental, mostly because of the fact that that weekly report was never published in any secondary accounts. So the number couldn't have been used from that particular report. Where it comes from, the source that we found it in appeared here as early as you see here, 1850. In a monograph. And this phrase, I'm putting it up as you see it, will appear in this exact same form with very little or no alteration at all for 4 decades, the last 4 decades of the 1800s. And it goes like this. When the encampment was begun at Valley Forge, the whole number of men in the field was 11,098, of whom 2,898 were unfit for duty. So that 11,098, beginning around the middle 1890s, was rounded off to 11,000, and all the way up to the present day. That's where this number has come from. It's 171 years now, and maybe it even traces earlier to 1850, but at least we've traced it back that far. So that's where the number comes from, that 11,098. And those of you that are familiar with the writings of George Washington, I think the clue that you probably see is that 2,898, because that comes from George Washington himself. And there he is, the Valley Forge image of him. So at least we got him close to this period. And in his letter to Congress, which was always sent to the head of Congress, in this case, it's Henry Lawrence, on December 23rd, this is that famous 3-option letter that he wrote where he says, because of the deficiencies in the commissary department, that this army must either starve, disperse, or dissolve. The more important part of this letter for today's standpoint is the numbers that he puts in there. And you see that 2898 again. We have by a field return this day made no less than 2,898 men now in camp unfit for duty. And he goes on to explain why, because they're barefoot and otherwise naked. And then he talks about the total number of troops that are fit for duty. And he goes out of his way. We need to keep in mind that he's only including troops in Valley Forge. Sullivan's old division, now Smallwood's 2 Maryland brigades, are in Wilmington already, but he puts them at 8,200 in camp fit for duty. So all they started doing in 1850 was adding the two numbers together. 8,200, 2898 equals 11,098. That's where the 11,000 came from. But this is, even though this was written on December 23rd, this has been the easy way for us to say that was the number of troops that marched into camp on December 19th. And we could tell you from that field return made this day, the December 23rd return, George Washington, for his own purposes, clearly was a bit of a propagandist and tried to present his army in the worst shape as possible with real numbers. But he's going to leave some things out of that report purposely. He's trying to stir Congress to action, and there's a heck of a lot of troops that he's not counting in that return. So what I want to do is break down a return that has not presented in our article, but just to show you as an example, for those of you that haven't seen one before. And to do that, we really need to realize how we're going to consider the Continental Army at Valley Forge. Is it an attacking force? Is it a defending force? Or is it an encampment force? I think we can all agree that during a 6-month encampment, we should look at the force at Valley Forge as an encampment force. And the reason I'm saying that is because Washington wasn't counting it as an encampment force when he wrote that letter on December 23rd. He was looking at it as an attacking force. He was looking at an opportunity to strike a big British reconnaissance force that was going to be heading out of Philadelphia and heading to Darby, Pennsylvania. That's what that whole letter generated from, that he had to call the attack off when he realized how many of his men were without shoes and clothes. These are two vastly different numbers, which the course of my little mini presentation in the next 10 slides or so is going to show you. So I'm going to start out by showing you half of a report. Okay, I'm sure many of you have seen these before, and I'm going to show you this one from February 7th. It's a weekly report. Mike and I, when we do a lot of work in 1777, and we were encouraged to see how many returns were conducted at Valley Forge during the December 19th to June 19th period. Prior to December 19th, the previous 7 months to it, there were only 3 known returns that took place from May 20th to 4, I should say, to December 19th. A weekly one in December, and then 2 monthly ones filed in early November and early December, and then the only one previous to that was May 20th. That was it. So imagine our surprise when we found all these other returns. Now, these have been published before. You should know, and some of you maybe already do, that back in 1976 in the bicentennial, Charles Lesser did us a world of good by publishing Sinews of Independence, where he transcribed all the monthly returns that were conducted at Valley Forge. And of course, before and afterwards, it wasn't a Valley Forge book, but it included Valley Forge returns. And recategorize some of the columns to make it more more interpretable, I should say. And you already should have got a hint that that number 11,000 was very misleading from that book. But that book clearly didn't catch fire because I think it was tended to be disregarded shortly after it came out. And there are things that Lesser didn't use that we are going to use. One of the things we discovered, not by being able to go to the archives or the Clement Library during COVID, but by using our Fold 3 accounts, our subscription accounts online, we have found, in addition to all those monthly returns that Lesser used, we have found several weekly returns. In fact, for the entire period of Valley Forge, we have counted up 27 returns. 27 of them. I'm going to use one. This is the February 7th weekly return. I'm only using it as an example. These 14 columns that are on the left-hand side of this big panoramic return are showing you in these 14 columns all the field officers, commissioned officers, staff officers, and non-coms, the NCOs, the personnel of sergeants, fifes, and drums. None of these are counted in George Washington's estimate when he's presenting that force on December 23rd, or whenever he talks about his army. He never includes officers. They fight and die on battlefields, but they're usually not included in his terminology when he's describing how many men that he has present for duty. And I see that kind of internal template carry on with Confederate generals when I do Civil War research. They break it down to who's carrying a gun, for example, and they usually don't tend to count officers either. But they certainly should count in an encampment, and as I will show you in a later slide, this is 2,500 officers and men. Or excuse me, at least officers. We'll get to the men in a minute. 2,500 officers that aren't counted. All right, so you know that they weren't counted in December. You know they're not counted generally in a lot of these returns if you're looking at it as an attacking force, even though most of them are present now. Granted, I'll give Washington credit. If you look in the middle, I'm not going to think that your paymaster is going to be involved in an attack upon the enemy, but he is in the camp. He's got to be fed and clothed every day. He counts as a soldier in the camp. All right, so keep that in mind. On the next slide, I'm going to go to what would appear on the right-hand side of that long report, part of it, the kind of the right middle section, when I'm looking at what's called rank and file. And by rank and file, we mean privates. And it's a whole different way to categorize them. I'm going to apologize in advance because this comes up blurry, but I just want to show you the column headings. Before I go to that slide, if you look at this one with all the officers by rows, if you're looking at the rows, and if you see my arrow under Woodford and Scott, these are the brigades. So each row is a brigade. There's 15 brigades here, 17 total brigades in Washington's Army of Infantry. 2 of them are at a different camp in Wilmington. So this is just the Valley Forge brigades and some other forces that are attached to it. All right, so when you see a blow up on the next slide showing the first 2 rows, that would be some of these Virginians formerly of Stevens' division from Scott and Woodford's brigade. All right, and this is the blow up. On the top, you see rank and file. And I'm going to show you the categories here. The whole idea is to present what's being counted and what's not. Here is present fit for duty. Well, that makes sense. All right, you count those guys, right? Because and Charles Lesser did that back in '76. And look at these next 2 columns: sick, present, sick, absent. It makes it very clear. The sick present are in camp. So the 92 is one brigade, the 87 is a sick present from the other brigade. These tend not to be counted in returns because the entire column is considered unfit for duty, and they assume not present. Well, true, I would think that most of your sick present aren't going to be the prime soldiers to use in an attack, but they're in camp. We have to count them. Sick absent, we do not count. They are sent away from camp. And then the next column is what Washington showed in that December 23rd letter that added up to 2898 for December 23rd. This is February 7th, and you still have huge numbers here, the equivalent size of large regiments within each of these brigades of unfit soldiers for want of shoes and clothes, CLOATH there. And the point is they are also in camp. So we count them. All right, because they are part of the encampment force. I'm going to skip this next column for a second. And the final column where it runs off the page is on furlough. Of course, on furlough would mean not in the camp any longer. We don't count that column. The interesting column, and we were enlightened to this, we originally weren't considering this as strongly, is this on command column. And you see in these first 2 brigades, 200 men on February 7th are considered on command and 149 in the next, and it goes down through the brigades. That on-command column on any given month for the entire infantry represented here for the rank and file can number anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 men at any given week. All right, and what does that mean? It not only means men, it means men that are present, fit for duty, but they're not with their respective regiments or with their respective brigades. They're detached. And detached doesn't necessarily mean away from camp. If you look at individual records, you could see men detached to serve as bakers. They could be served as armorers. It's not unusual to see an infantryman detached to serve in the artillery park. Now, he's not going to be counted in the artillery return as an artillerist. That would be double counting him. He's going to be counted in the on-command column. He might serve in the paymaster department. These are all people that are still in camp. So the question is, how many of these on command are in camp and how many of them are not in camp? And we were very fortunate that the adjutant general, probably him, and in this case, except for the first three returns, it's Alexander Scammell. I found on the cover of the May monthly report, he puts together this little calculation. He does this for the Valley Forge Army, and he does this for the small 2 brigades that are at Wilmington. And he does this determinant. He is looking at the number of men that might act on an emergency. Let's read between the lines. On an emergency probably means if Valley Forge all of a sudden comes under a surprise British attack. Who can be immediately called upon to help repel this attack? That's the way I'll interpret it. All right. So the way he's looking at that is, well, we have all those 6 present soldiers in camp. We can't use all of them because they're too sick and not to be used in this way. But he is determined by his little formula that 2/3 of them at any given time, based on this report, can be called upon to act on an emergency. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? But then he has a column for the on command. All right. On command that may act in an emergency. The suggestion there is in this particular time frame for that monthly report at that time, 1,425 soldiers who are detached from their units and normally would never be counted as part of an encampment must be in the camp because you can call on them right away to serve in an emergency. All right. Can we turn that into a fraction like the 2/3? Yes, we can. All right, because we have the total number for that time frame, and I believe it was like 2550. So when I ran the math on that, it was 58%. I looked at underneath this. I blew this up so you don't see the Wilmington, which would have been below this. He used the same formula. It broke down that the Wilmington force on command was 58% of the total. So what he's saying is, on any given day, 58% of the on command soldiery is still in the camp or close enough to the boundaries that we can call upon them. They are there. They're close. Now, how can I be confident to rely on this report to say that it'll count for the entire encampment at Valley Forge? I'll tell you this, if this was February 7th, which is my example that I showed you before this slide, I couldn't say that with very much confidence, right? Because that's when the Army's kind of socked in. That's when you had your only really heavy snowstorm early at that time. So you couldn't say that applied across the board. This number, this 58%, is derived on May 30th. Okay, so that's when the roads are opened up, when you would expect more of the Army to be detached, doing all the extra service outside of camp, and yet still on this given day, 1,424 of them, or 58%, are considered still in camp. So I am more confident to be able to say if I see that on May 30th, anything previous to that, I would say that 58% should still hold if the number isn't even higher than that. So that's why I'm using that 58%. So now let's take a look at how Mike and I count this up. So here's our methodology. We're going to count up infantry directly from the reports. That's your rank and file, starting present for duty, sick present, unfit for lack of shoes, just like we had showed you on the returns. We're also going to count those 14 columns of officers because they're all present for duty. Remember that one slide I showed you 2 slides ago showing all those different categories. You count all of those. Then the semi-derived ones is that 58% of the on-command column. And then here's the one that gets a little tougher. And I'm going to show you that Mike and I took a minimalist approach to this. The assumption, if you look at any return at any given month, the total number of soldiers, rank and file, that are sick and present for the entire Army in the encampment can number anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000. All right, it's an amazing number. And to assume that no officers are sick or without shoes at that same time is unbelievable. It just can't occur. So we do have to make an accommodation for that. I will tell you, in later encampments, they do have a separate column for officers who are sick and who are on command and who are shoeless, but that doesn't exist at Valley Forge. Your first return where it shows that is in December of 1778 when they're at Morristown. So I'll give you a hint of what those numbers are when I get to my last slide. So what we decided to do as a minimalist approach is only count the NCOs, the non-coms, the sergeants and the fife and drums. Our assumption is, hey, these guys marched just about every single step that every soldier marched, so their shoes are going to wear out just as quickly. They're not on horses, and they're not any more immune than your rank and file. There's nothing special about them in that regard with their immune system, so they're likely to get just as sick as well. I lowered it by a few percentage points at any given return to make it seem like they were given a little bit of special treatment, but in general, I'm going to count the non-coms and do a determinant based on the total number by the percentage of sick rank and file to the total and apply that to the non-coms. And then what Washington never counts, and we always have to count, every single day of the encampment, essentially, the artillery is at Valley Forge. The cavalry isn't, but the artillery is, and we have to count them, all right? So that's anywhere from 5 to 750, depending on the month or the week. Officers and men present, fit, and present sick. We didn't do any derivations for them. We just used the actual numbers from the reports. So all I want to do now is go back to that February 7th report, applying our methodology to show you how this would have compared to Washington's December 23rd formula, and give you the idea before we get to Mike showing the results of how our 11,000 can no longer be considered the march-in forts. All right, let's take a look at that February 7th report. Rank and file, fit for duty and without shoes. That's Washington's fit formula that he sent to Henry Lawrence, 8,871. All right, that makes sense because remember what Washington sent? A total of 11,098. Fewer recruits between December 23rd and February 7th, a lot more sick and dying men. Okay, that army shrunk apparently, right? Well, there's more than that, isn't there? Let's go to our other additions. Rank and file, sick, present, from the reports, not any derivations at all. 1,490, add that to the total, and you're looking at now over 10,000 rank and file soldiers in February. But you got to note, of those 10,000, only 50% of them are fit, but they're all in the camp. That's the key here. They're all in the camp. All officers present fit for duty. That's the 14 left-hand columns. Add them all up, 2,575. On command rank and file using that 4/7 formula, 57, 58%, 1,465 for February 7th. My derivation for just non-coms, officers sick, present, without shoes, 1,350. That 8,871, the Washington formula that you see at the top, all of a sudden becomes 15,751 infantry, and you got to add the artillery. Now we're looking at 16,310 Continentals. From now on, when Mike and I present a number, all you have to do in your mind from this point on is put the two words at least in front of our numbers that we present verbally or by slide, because look what we're not counting. We have no way to tally this. And I want to show you how this minimalist approach is really just getting at the heart of it, but not really getting you the true number. George Washington is never counted in any report. His military family at the Potts House, which could number with the household staff into 30 or so, isn't counted as well. None of the 14 brigade commanders or the former division commanders, Green and Sterling and Sullivan, they're not counted, neither are their staffs. Field commission and staff officers that are sick, I didn't count them at all right? The non-coms that are on command, I didn't count them. I want to just show you from a year later, they were tallied on reports. Look at the numbers that we're missing. If I use the same formula of 58%, obviously it could change in a year, but we're looking at 450 on command and 150 present sick. That's another 600 men. And we're looking at an encampment a year later in which only a third of the soldiers at any given time were as sick as they were at Valley Forge. So we're really underplaying that number. Teamsters, other artificers, sutlers, blacksmiths, armorers, all of the professional personnel that aren't Continental soldiers, we're not counting them either. The only way we're counting them is by that on command file when soldiers are serving temporarily in that duty, but we're not counting the real professionals that are serving in those roles. Camp followers and their families. Now, for example, when General Howe landed at Head of Elk, he had an army of 16,000, but what marched off those ships was over 20,000 human beings because there was that many camp followers, family, and other professionals. Now, I'm not saying there's 5,000 of these extra people in at Valley Forge, but I think there's at least several hundred and probably well over 1,000. We don't count the militia, even though Mike and I will tell you that on certain returns, militia happened to be at the camp at the time of the return, and they're included. We decided for consistency's sake to just say that we're only going to look at Continental soldiers at Valley Forge, and then we're not counting any area residents that are consumed by the encampment. So my point is that 16,310 is going to swell to well over 17,000 on February 7th. Valley Forge, even in its leanest months, is going to be at least the size of the third largest population center in the United States. And in this case, it's getting closer and closer to rivaling the second. So the last thing I'm going to do before we answer any questions about the methodology and go to Mike is I want to show you one little stickling point that even makes our minimalist approach even more minimalist. Is what I saw Adjutant General Scammell write at the end of the May report. That template that was used at Valley Forge with all the columns for rank and file included, as you saw from one of my slides, officers unfit for want of clothes and shoes. That disappears from all the reports beginning in April. You don't see that column anymore. And remember, we had a huge transformation in the quartermaster and commissary department, especially in quartermaster when General Green took over. But it doesn't solve the problem. This May 30th report tells us that the adjutant general that there are 1,263 RNF, that was his word, that's rank and file, obviously, unfit for duty for want of arms, clothes, and accoutrements. The question is, did he count those in the total number on the report? Mike's going to present a row showing that May 30th monthly return. And I decided we're not going to include that number because I'm not sure that they weren't included, but my guess is they were not because he didn't have a column to put them in. That's why he wrote it as an addition at the end of May. Why am I telling you this? Because there are several columns that Mike will present in April, from April and May on, where you don't have that want of clothes in. So maybe in your mind, you know it's at least, but maybe you have to add at least anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 to every single time point for unfit for want of clothes for those soldiers, because they are still in camp as well. And with that, I'll stop for any pause for questions before we go to Mike showing the numbers.
So if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A or the chat box asking about the methodology. So I'll start things off by just asking. So when you were talking about the officers that were sick present, you came up with a figure where you're only counting the non-coms. As clarification, when we see the returns listing the officers, those were only the fit for duty officers that appear in the returns?
Right. And all the way until December of 78, there is no infantry column. Now there is for artillery that appears later on in 78, but not until the winter encampment in Morristown do they have a whole separate column for officers not present. So the point is, we know that there are officers in camp that aren't fit for duty. We just don't have a real good way to capture those. And the reason why we know that they're there is because when we do count them later in the war, there's several hundred of them. And what was most surprising to me is seeing how many were on command that weren't counted. So a lot of them probably stayed within the campgrounds as well. I just have no way to capture it.
Yeah, I think one of the really great accomplishments of your methodology really is getting down to that figure, the 58, 57, 58%. for the on command, those who are present, because that's one of those big question marks, right? If you, for those who haven't looked at a muster roll, if you look at a muster roll that actually lists all the names of the soldiers in a single company, and many will say on command, and sometimes it'll say on command with a certain officer. So if that officer is present, you have a pretty good idea that they're, detached maybe from the company, but serving as like a waiter or a batman to an officer. They're kind of cooking and, polishing the steel and the leather and everything that, a waiter would do for an officer in the Army. But others will just say on command, and it doesn't really say where they are. It might mean that they are kind of away escorting, a wagon in from like Reading or something like that, or they, are carrying the company payroll from, somewhere. I mean, they're just on some kind of detached duty at the time that the muster roll is coming out. So that figure, 58%, that it's really nice that you have something grounded in the documentation of the time that tries to figure out what percentage of those men are in camp. Man.
Thank you, Adjutant General Scammell for helping us with that. And it is very important that he did that at the end of the May report, because I couldn't use 58% if that was in the early winter, because I would expect more of that on command to be detached and farther away from camp as the weather gets warmer. So I'm more confident of the 58% applying to the earlier months, because that was at the end of May.
Have you seen any figures like that for other parts of the war, other encampments?
I've never looked. I'll be honest. I'm just
fair enough.
Pinpointed on Valley Forge.
Well, it's great that you found it at all. So,
well, very lucky. We were very lucky on that one.
We have a question from our attendees. So, any record of sick or unfit for duty who were moved to Yellow Springs? So, I assume those at Yellow Springs Hospital would be included in the sick absent column.
Yes, it wouldn't be all. Obviously, it wouldn't be all of the sick absent, but right. You would expect that we never counted them. We don't count any sick absent. But the big Yellow Spring Foundation that's still there today, that they were columned as sick and absent at Valley Forge. Yep. Yeah. As well as other hospitals.
And if they did return to camp, then they would be listed like fit for duty or sick present.
Right. Or sick present, right.
Yeah.
And the key is, when Washington doesn't want to count them for obvious reasons, he's not going to send them toward Darby because they're too sick to be an attacking force. But we look at them as an encampment. He's got to feed them every day. You got to look at how the commissary and quartermasters are going to take care of these men as well.
Yeah, and of course, descendants of these soldiers, they only care about whether or not their ancestor was at Valley Forge. They don't care if they happen to be in the, fit for duty column necessarily. They want to know if they're at Valley Forge or not. So it is interesting that the numbers that maybe we value as historians aren't necessarily the logistical ones that they are using all the time in their reports.
Right.
But would the commissary have more solid numbers? I mean, if they actually have to feed the troops, you'd think they need a bottom line number somewhere, right?
Well, they have separate forage reports, and there is only one that I know that was collected that survived. I believe it's sometime in February. I personally have never seen it, but that could give us more insight as well. You probably have it at the park. If you do, Mike and I would like to see it.
All right, well, we'll have to email on that out later.
But I think there is only one that survived for the Valley Forge period.
Gotcha. We do have an additional question. How does this compare with the British Army in reporting their troops? Do you know at all about how they reported rank and file versus officers? Myself, I've mostly looked at pay lists, which aren't helpful at all because they pay everybody, doesn't matter where they are. So I don't know. What experience do you have?
No, I have an answer to that. There's commissary reports for the British Army.
That would make sense.
There's copies of which at HSP, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, has copies of them. They list everybody, camp followers, teamsters, anybody the Army has to feed. But they do not list the officers because officers in the British Army are responsible for feeding themselves.
Yeah.
Just like Civil War armies are going to be in this country later in history. So the officers are not listed in those reports. But you could derive the officers. There's other ways that, I can't remember who did it. There's a list of British officers that served in the Philadelphia campaign. I forget who published it and who compiled it. It might be George Inman off the top of my head. So that's where you can get the officer list for how many officers were with the British Army, even though they're not on the commissary reports. At least that's what I've used.
Excellent. And a final question. Do you think Washington purposely underreported troop strength in an effort to encourage Congress or the states to recruit and enlist more troops?
Yeah, the answer is yes, particularly on that December 23rd report. You know, we talked about the weekly and monthly reports. I'll make this short. There were a couple of special field reports that he ordered, one in June and one in December. The December 23rd one, it was a stripped down report that only looked at, it did report on non-coms. Washington didn't include that in the letter to Henry Lawrence. So they're certainly going to take part in the attack as well. So he purposely stripped that down as a propaganda tool to show it to Henry Lawrence. But I will say, whenever Washington expresses numbers, there's a council of war that he holds in September, and we don't have a report that coincides with it, but it might have been one of these other field reports. He does the same thing, in which he doesn't include officers. He always uses the word rank and file. So he never considers, when he's adding up numbers of his army, he strips out artillery, obviously strips out cavalry, and because they're not including artillery, and then he strips out even officers, even non-coms. So,
yeah.
So yes, he minimizes the numbers particularly for Congress, but I think it's just his natural depiction of his army is how he does it is rank and file.
All right. So Gary kind of did a very good job of explaining how we came up with the numbers we came up with. So let's actually look at these numbers at different periods of the encampment. And really how this all started was trying to figure out, I was trying to figure out the order of battle and army strength for the Whitemarsh operation 3 weeks before Valley Forge. That's really how this happened. And I started putting those numbers together, and I was getting a crazy number in the mid 20,000s. And I was like, well, how many guys got the Valley Forge? And I went and looked at a couple different sources, and I kept finding that 11,000 number. And something wasn't making sense to me. How did 12, 13,000 guys just vanish in 3 weeks? It wasn't, the numbers weren't jiving. So that's how this kind of got going, and why we got crazy looking in the numbers and our heads started to explode. So really the story, you need to understand the marching force. We need to look at the Whitemarsh numbers. So on December 3rd, there was the monthly strength report for November was completed. That return lists 20, this is including, this number includes sick, present. Basically, it's the methodology that Gary explained. So that number was 22,824 Continental Infantry and the Maryland and Pennsylvania militia. Now, there's an issue with this number because there's people missing from it. The Light Dragoons aren't on that list. Daniel Morgan's riflemen aren't on that report, and the artillerymen aren't on that report. The 497 Dragoons is from a report at the end of December, and that's where I get this number from. My Daniel Morgan number is an estimate of how many people came with him from Saratoga. That's sort of a low estimate. The artillerymen's from a report in Timothy Pickering's papers for a little bit later in the month. That's where that number comes from. So you add those numbers into that number on the previous slide. So remember we had 22,824, add in these missing units that are not listed on that report, and we have 24,381 men at Whitemarsh 3 weeks before they get the Valley Forge. Process that for a second. That's a big number. It's hard to believe that only 11,000 march in on December 19th. right? So do we really believe 13,000 soldiers just disappear in 16 days? I have huge problem believing that. And so when we start digging, where's that 13,000 number disappear from? So yes, there were some casualties between December 3rd and the 19th. We have the fighting at Whitemarsh. We have the minor engagement at Matson's Ford. And so we can approximately say there's 300 casualties in that 16-day period. But it still doesn't explain the 13,000 man difference. So what we found when we started looking through fold3.com is we found a December 22nd weekly return. This is 3 days after they arrive at Valley Forge. That return, which Gary already talked about, had 11,026 officers and men. But again, that return is missing a bunch of people. That return, actually I should have deleted that. I thought I fixed this. Don't worry about the Maryland brigades because they already left for Wilmington. That's why they're not on that report. The two Maryland brigades do not march in with the rest of the Army. They left for Wilmington prior to the march-in. But there are 3 independent regiments that are missing from that report that do participate in the march-in before they leave for Lancaster, where they're going to spend the winter. Some of those additional Continental regiments, I forget which ones off the top of my head, but some of those 16 additional Continental regiments. So they are definitely missing from the report. Lord Sterling's 2 brigades. So the North Carolina Brigade, or no, definitely the New Jersey Brigade, and the other one, is it the North Carolina Brigade, Gary, that was missing? I forget. Anyway, it's the 2 brigades under Sterling. And then again, Morgan, the Dragoons, and the artillerymen are missing from that report. Now, yes, the Maryland and Pennsylvania militia are missing, but we decided not to count them, and we don't think that they actually marched in with the rest of the Army. We think they stayed in the vicinity of the Gulf where the Army marched from to enter Valley Forge. So we're not really worried about the fact that they're missing. So what was the Army strength? There was about 22,224. But again, we need to take out the militia from that number, which is about 3,000 guys between the Maryland and the New Jersey militia. So you take out those guys and we have a march-in total of 19,224. So what does that tell us? There was about 1,800 deaths and desertions during the month of December. But it also tells us that their traditional number of 11,000 is at least 8,000 short of what marched in. Because again, we're providing low estimates when we're coming up with our numbers. It could have been more than this. Okay, so here's kind of the breakdown that was included in our article. So off the December 22 return, we have 15 infantry brigades, 17 independent regiments. This is the present fit for duty number. Now the numbers for Sterling's two brigades came off a separate return we found for the 23rd. So even though they're not on the 22nd return, we found them the very next day on a separate return. So that's where the numbers for those 2 brigades come from. Then we have the sick present number and the guys wanting shoes. This is officers and men, or at least NCOs and men, I should say. The on command number, that's using our estimate that for the formula Gary found on one of those returns. The Dragoon number is the exact number from the December 31st return. This is before they leave for Trenton. They're part of the march-in, so they are there. Then we have our estimate for Morgan's guys. And then we have the artillery estimate. Actually, this is not an estimate. This is the exact number from the December 22nd return in Timothy Pickering's papers. So that's if you add all this up, that's how we get our march-in total of 19,224. Okay. So then we have the 6 months of the encampment, right? And so I gotta give Gary all the credit for this because he's the one that put this table together. I can't take credit for this one. We were trying to come up with how much does the Army fluctuate over that 6 month period. So you have 4 columns here, right? The left column is pretty straightforward. This is the column of everybody that's fit, present in camp, officers and men. that are, this is what you would find in lesser if you were looking at one of the monthly returns. But then what's missing from that number, but would have been in the encampment force, maybe not able to go fight a battle right away, but were there in the camp, is the unfit present. So this is like you're talking sick present, maybe some of those on duty numbers. If you add that in, those sick present and on duty to the fit present for duty, that's how you get the number in the second column. So basically you're adding in your sick present and your on duty and your guys that need shoes. That's how you get the second column. Then you got to add in the adjusted column. So those formulas that we derive for the guys that are missing, like those sick NCOs, and I think that's mainly the number that changes there is the sick NCOs. So then this is using the math Gary went over, how we get the adjusted column for who's actually present in the camp. So this is everybody they have to feed and clothe, whether they're sick or healthy, or whether they have shoes or no shoes. This is everybody that's physically in one of those huts. Or if they're an officer, maybe in one of the nicer houses that were scattered around the encampment site. And then this is based off that formula that we found that Scammell had come up with of what percentage of this force that's physically present in the camp is available if the British come attack us. And so that's how you get this number on the fourth column here. So what's important here? What are we looking at here? The Army never dips below 14,000 present in the encampment, which is, process this for a minute. The Army had about 16,000 at Brandywine. The Army's got up between 14 and 15,000 at Germantown. So even at its worst, when the encampment and the sickness and the lack of food is at its worst at the Valley Forge encampment, the Army's present strength in camp is never dips far below what was available for the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. So they are still a very sizable force. And this gets back to what Gary mentioned earlier, that only Philadelphia and New York's population exceeded Valley Forge at this time. We're basically going to exceed the population of Boston, which was the third largest population center at Valley Forge during the winter of 77, 78. And I hope it magnifies these findings. I hope these findings magnify. We know how bad the supply situation was at Valley Forge. It's been written about in a dozen books. But now you got to look at that supply situation and how much worse it was, considering that the numbers that we've accepted for 150 years are wrong, and that the Army at times was double what we thought was there. Well, now those supply issues are even worse than what we thought before. And also, we're not taking into account the need to supply other areas where troops are wintering. There was 2 brigades and some artillery in Wilmington. The Dragoon Brigade was at Trenton. There was several independent regiments in Lancaster. A little bit later in the campaign, the New Jersey line will move over to New Jersey and leave Valley Forge, but they still have to be clothed and fed. So we're not even factoring in all that. We're just focused on who was at Valley Forge. But it's important to realize they also have to supply and feed these other encampment sites. So then how many leave, right? There is a June 13 weekly return, 6 days before they depart for the march towards Monmouth. And that return shows us, after we did our calculations, 16,649 fit and sick officers and men that likely marched out. So I think I have this broken down here. Yeah, so you've got present fit for duty and all duty. There's your 15,000. There's our estimate of the on-command force that could be used in an emergency. Now the sick present becomes an issue because that number is coming from that December 13 return, but how many of them are left behind because they're too sick to march with the Army? They were present sick in camp, but are they healthy enough to leave with the Army? And how much of the on-duty force or on-command force is left in administrative functions and don't march out with the Army? So there's some debate on this of how many of these sick guys are left behind, or how many of them were dropped off in Philadelphia, or how many of the on-duty guys or new on-duty numbers are created when they reoccupy Philadelphia to deal with administrative functions. There's some, we could have that debate, but this is the estimate we came up with in the article. If you leave behind 3,600 of those sick guys, this is roughly the amount that's going to march out of the encampment, 16,649. Now, what does that mean for Monmouth? I don't know if I deleted that. No, I did. Okay. On the way to Monmouth, they're going to pick up the New Jersey line, which was not at Valley Forge at this point. The Dragoons are going to rejoin the Army from their encampment site, and New Jersey militia is going to be added to the Army during the march to Monmouth. So a conservative estimate of the available strength at Monmouth is 19,648. That's very nearly the same exact number that arrived at Valley Forge 6 months previous. So despite as awful and horrible the conditions and the experience was at Valley Forge, when they go into the fight at Monmouth, they basically have the same force that they entered Valley Forge with, which I seriously doubt anybody's really processed and got through their heads in the last 150 years or looked at it in the same way Gary and I have looked at it. So that's huge. All right, I think, so again, what are the implications? And we know that this is going to take some hardcore rethinking the way we tell things. And if I was working at Valley Forge and I'd been given the same statistics every day for 15 years on my tours, it's hard to change what you're programmed to say. I get that. And you can have serious disagreements with us, and we're okay with that too. But I think at the very least, it requires a rethinking of how we view the experience at Valley Forge. Again, I said this earlier, it became the third largest population center in the country for 6 months. And the implications on the supply issues are enormous. And like Gary said, we're not even counting anybody that's not on the rolls. So camp followers, Teamsters, civilian workers for the Army. We're not counting any of that. And so the supply issues are just massive. And I think that's it. I think I just have a plug here, which I won't worry about. But I'm sure you guys have questions. Justin may have questions, but I know Gary did the heavy lifting here, explaining our methodology, but hopefully you understand the breakdown of what I just gave you in my end of the presentation. But we'll be happy to take questions. Let me see here. Let me get out of my screen share. Oh,
Already done. So I have a couple of questions here. So when it comes to that, those who are sick and left behind, I will comment and say that if you pick up any regiment's company returns, so all the companies in a regiment, and you finger through them, you will find, sick left at Valley Forge, sick left at Valley Forge, sick left at Valley Forge. So the idea that, that many 3,600 are left behind in camp, that is believable in my estimate. What I find very interesting, though, is that traditionally the narrative is this very small force limps in December, and the Army not only rebuilt, through the efforts of Nathaniel Greene, as this amazing quartermaster general, but also with Baron von Steuben's training, with bringing that Prussian discipline, to the Army, that all because of these efforts, they arrive with an army that was bigger than the army that marched in by several thousand. And yet what we're seeing here, I mean, if you just look at not even the Monmouth number, which is about equal, but just the number that marches in and the number that marches out, it looks like the number that marches out is actually slightly smaller, right?
It is because
only because of the sick present that stayed in the camp.
No, that's not the only reason. No, Gary, that's not the only reason. Several of the units that marched in are not there for the march out. The
yes.
Dragoons,
oh, that's right.
The Jersey line, they marched in, but then they're not there for the march out.
Right.
And what I did before too is and it's not included in the article, is that there's permanent losses, deaths, desertions. I forget what my third D was. I'm missing it in my head here. Detachments. So those three, they're gone permanently. And I counted through, there's a little over 2,000 deaths, and total with desertions and detachments about 5,000, but they're offset by 5,000 recruits. So yes, the size of the force that left Valley Forge in June is about the same size roughly that came in, that's embarking on the Monmouth campaign, but the quality of the soldiery, I don't know. I don't know if the deaths were really these new recruits who weren't used to being huddled close together at times when typhoid was being spread around the camp. So that's a major league project for somebody to calculate. In other words, I'd be really interested to know on June 19th, how many of those men that marched out were true veterans of the 76 campaign,
Right.
of which we only think about 2,500 participated in 77. And how many of those were, what percentage of the army that marched out toward Monmouth was actually experienced at Brandywine and Germantown?
Even the militia at this point the ranks are going to be filled with veterans who have actually seen a few firefights.
Right.
Yeah. So you began by talking about Charles Lesser's book, Sinews of Independence. If people are not familiar, this book, it really details all of these returns, and they're nicely transcribed. And I'd mentioned this to you guys before that, I'd pick up this book and fingered through it, and you look and like, right, that number is way bigger. And, in the back of my mind, I knew something wasn't quite right, but it's nice to see that you guys picked up on that same, inconsistency and ran with it and went so much further. If any of the attendees have additional questions, now is a good time to ask before we wrap up. And if we look at these implications again, the death statistics, 2,000 roughly, that's roughly what has been reported to me, at least, for years and years. So you think that figure has somewhat stayed the same?
Yeah, I think I counted from all the weekly and monthly rolls. I came up to a number like something like 1,960, and that would have been just the soldiers. I don't know how many camp followers died or other people within the camp.
Exactly.
So that number made sense. And of course, I know this has been reported before, but the rate of death in the last 10 weeks of the encampment certainly seemed to be a heck of a lot higher than in the first 10 weeks. That's what I noticed. And maybe as the Army grew in size, maybe we understand this more with COVID, when the disease spreads in closed spaces and the Army's more concentrated. I mean, we keep talking about it being the third largest population center, but in terms of the actual amount of space that these 14 to 18,000 men occupied compared to the big cities, maybe in terms of concentration, it's even higher in that rank, and that's why the disease spread is a little more.
Yeah, I think there's also accumulation of filth. If you read in the orderly books, they're becoming desperate to get these huts clean. At one point, they basically abandon them and start setting up tents just to get people out of the huts. They're trying to ventilate them, sweep out and change the hay as quickly as possible. So there is that. Also, any new arriving troops, many of them are immediately inoculated with smallpox, or inoculated. Those who didn't get inoculated before their arrival have to get inoculated upon arrival. I have found instances of that. So, there's going to be a natural percentage point for, it may only be 1% of those inoculated die, but yeah. But if you take those deaths and now instead of 2,000 deaths compared to 11,000 marching in, the 2,000 deaths compared to the new margin figure, or even like just the January figure, after some of them leave to Wilmington and so on, the percentage mortality rate is much, much lower. That's another significant implication here of your research.
Yeah, that's true, but it's still in terms of, it's been a while since I've looked at these numbers, but I think, what is it, 26,000 Revolutionary War soldiers died in those 8 years, and 8,000 died in battle, and 17,000 died away from the battlefield. I still think in a 6-month encampment to have 2,000 die in that 6 months is probably the highest concentration of any other period of the war.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, sounds accurate. But yeah, so the only thing that I would like to point out here in the end is that there are a lot of people who read your article. I mean, I spoke with volunteers, I spoke with park rangers. A lot of people reading it, their main takeaway was, this is a compelling argument. I can't argue with it, but I still find it hard to go that extra step and accept it. You know, there's almost like this agnosticism that kicks in where they're not, you know, they're not sure whether or not to believe it. Is there any compelling reason to mistrust any of the data that you presented?
No. In fact, like I said, they put those 2 words in front of everything we said, at least. We're that confident that the numbers are at least. We think we took a minimalist approach.
Exactly.
And even if you don't agree with if you don't think the 57% of the on-command column held throughout the encampment, you're only talking about a difference of maybe 400 to 500 soldiers. It doesn't drastically change what we presented at all. Again, just looking at Charles Lesser's numbers, he got pretty close to where we were getting. We just did the final, I won't call it finessing, because I think it was a very strongly supported calculus, so to speak, of how to get to that correct figure. We think we're closer to it, but I still want to say it's at least.
But so, even if you don't buy into all of our math, we're still not counting a lot of people that we know were there. You know, without counting the camp followers, without counting generals and their staffs, without counting civilian employees, we're not counting any of that. So even if you don't buy some of our math, you could still figure that our numbers are close because we're not counting all that.
Right. And we're assuming that one commissioned officer was sick in camp.
Yeah.
which is ridiculous. There's 2,500 of them.
All right. Well, you certainly left us with well, really a lot of work to figure out how best to incorporate this into all of our interpretation, whether it's you know, as volunteers who are working at the park, I'm sure the park rangers, the encampment store, which gives tours, the trolley tours once COVID, you know, comes to an end. But so yeah, there will be quite a few people that will likely be incorporating this into their interpretation. So we're all very grateful for the work that you've done. If you have any follow-ups, any other further insights that come your way, don't hesitate to email me personally. I'd be very interested in hearing that, and yeah, we'll do our best to spread the word. But yeah,
Mike, if I could have a final comment, just
please.
On this, is from the other end, I wouldn't be accepting of something new right away. I'd like to see the primary evidence. So I encourage everybody that it was available to us. We took it right off those reports. So that notation about the percentage of on command, it comes right from those weekly and monthly reports. And I'm sure the park has those reports available, at least in some form, for everybody to look at.
Well, thank you very much for everything. This has been yeah, most enlightening, and hopefully we'll yeah, we'll make good use of your research. So I cannot thank you enough. And yeah, Valley Forge Park Alliance is very grateful as well. And again, you can find this video and others on our YouTube channel. I'll be uploading this later today. And don't hesitate to go to vfparkalliance.org, check out our events page, find out any future events in the series, as well as embedded videos for past recordings of events. So on behalf of the Valley Forge Park Alliance, Michael and Gary, thank you very much for joining us today. This has been great.
Thank
Thank you.
you.